originally derived from Aristotle, Boethius, and others. So my understanding or my definition of these concepts are as follows. Hardcore connexivism maintains that the connexive principles hold for absolutely every proposition or propositions P and Q. Why? So this gives rise to the full formulas, which we have seen in several variants so far in different talks during this workshop. So I don't have to explain these formulas, first and second Aristotelian thesis. I refer to the first one as Aristotle's first thesis because in his discussion, which was presented and analyzed by Sarah in a talk 2 days ago, he starts from this consideration: can a proposition Q be entailed both by P and by non-Q? And then in the course of his argument or his proof that this cannot be the case, he comes up with, if that would be the case, then some proposition would be entailed by its own negation, but this cannot be, this is impossible, this is absurd. So this is his second thesis in the course of his own considerations. Here, similarly, I add the counterparts where just the negation is shifted from the antecedent to the consequent, and I refer to these principles as Abelard's first and second principle. Humble connexivism admits that the connexive principles may have some exceptions, namely impossible antecedents and necessary consequence. So formalization of humble connexivity would amount to the following principles. Aristotle's first thesis in the humble variant says, if Q is not necessary, then it can't be the case that Q is entailed both by P and also by not P. And the humble version of Aristotle's second thesis similarly says, if Q is not necessary, then it can't be the case that Q is entailed by its own negation. And similarly for the counterparts, the Abelardian thesis. So next, let's talk about truth conditions for implications. The really vast majority of ancient and medieval logicians considered an implication as true or the corresponding inference as valid if and only if it can't be the case that the antecedent P is true and yet the consequent is false. This is basically the same requirement as the definition of a strict implication as suggested in the 20th century by C.I. Lewis. However, this definition gives rise to the so-called paradoxes of strict implication. The first paradox results from the insight that if a proposition P is impossible, then it is a fortiori impossible that P is true and some Q is false. Thus, according to the aforementioned definition, an impossible antecedent strictly implies each consequent, no matter which proposition Q one considers. And second paradox similarly consists in the observation that if a proposition Q is necessary, then Q will be strictly implied by each antecedent P, because if it's impossible that Q is false, then it is a fortiori impossible that P is true and Q is false. From the 13th century onwards, these paradoxes have been referred to as the principles ex impossibile quod libet and necessarium ad quod libet. Abelard clearly recognized that the standard conception of implication, which I just explained, entails principle ex impossibile quod libet. He considered in particular the example, si Socrates est lapis est asinus, and he argued that the antecedent cannot be true without the consequent, because, short Latin quotation from his Dialectica, quod enim omnino non potest esse verum, et sine ille non potest esse verum, or as the Niels explained, for it is impossible that Socrates should be a stone, and so impossible that he should be a stone without being an ass. In order to avoid this consequence of accepting the crucial example as true conditional, Abelard suggested a stronger truth condition for conditionals, according to which the antecedent of a true conditional requires the consequent intrinsically. This is one interpretation given, I think, in this case by the Niels, or as Christopher Martin put it, the antecedent is required to be relevant to the consequence in that its truth is genuinely sufficient for that of the consequent, and this is guaranteed by the consequent being in some way contained in the antecedent. As a standard example of a true relevant implication, Abelard mentions, si Socrates est homo est animal. If Socrates is a man, then he is an animal. This conditional must be true because the concept animal is contained in the concept man. And more generally, such a containment obtains whenever the subject term S denotes a certain species, while the predicate term P denotes the corresponding kind. For instance, si Socrates est asinus, est animal. If Socrates is an ass, he is an animal. This is true for Abelard. And similar also this example, si Socrates est margarita, Socrates est lapis. If Socrates is a pearl, he is a stone. So Abelard does not object to consider impossible antecedents, but not everything follows from such an impossible antecedents, but only shows those consequences which are not naturally contained in this assumption of the antecedent. As a standard example for an implication which is not relevantly true, Abelard mentions, si Socrates est homo, non est lapis. Socrates is a man, then he is not a stone. Here, as the Niels explain, the sense of the consequent is not contained in the sense of the antecedent. The truth of the proposition is not based on conceptual containment, but only on our experience, which shows that the concepts man and stone are disparate. Chris Martin believes that more generally, for Abelard, no conditional is relevantly true if the antecedent is an affirmative proposition, while the consequent is a negative one. Here's a quotation from Martin's paper, who says, one of the defining features of his logic is the theorem that a conditional whose antecedent and consequent differ in quality cannot be true. Now, Abelard himself was really convinced of the correctness of Aristotle's thesis, according to which, as he paraphrased it, ad affirmationem et negationem ejusdem non sequitur idem consequens. For instance, the propositions si est homo est animal and si non est homo est animal cannot both be true, because otherwise one might derive the inconveniency si non est animal est animal. More generally, Abelard believed in the unrestricted validity of all these basic principles. first and second Aristotelian thesis and his Abelardian counterparts. However, these principles turned out to be incompatible with certain other logical principles which Abelard considered as indispensable. And this was shown by a series of arguments which Chris Martin has quite aptly characterized as embarrassing arguments. Contemporary logicians in the 12th century developed the following argument against the second Abelardian thesis, starting from this first premise or proposition saying that if Socrates is a man and a stone, they conclude, and Socrates is a man. But next, if Socrates is a man, Socrates is not a stone. So third, if Socrates is a man and a stone, Socrates is not a stone. But four, if Socrates is not a stone, Socrates is not a man and a stone. So fifth, if Socrates is a man and a stone, Socrates is not a man and a stone. So let's have a closer look at the logic behind this argument. The first proposition is just an instance of a well-known law of conjunction, conjunctive simplification. Conjunction entails the first conjunct. The second instance is not a really logical principle. It's just a principle which is considered by many people as true, but it's not true for merely logical reasons, but because of the meaning of the terms involved here. And then third step was to conclude just by transitivity from 1 and 2 that P and Q entails non-Q. Then the fourth step is obtained similarly by another application of rule of conjunctive simplification. P and Q, of course, implies Q's, hence by contraposition, non-Q implies not non-P and Q. And so finally you get this result, P and Q implies the negation of P and Q by transitivity from 3 and 4. Now, in the tradition of Boëthius, medieval logicians normally adopted what they called the topic of opposites, or they don't call it, of course, in English, locus oppositorum, as the following rule: regula si aliquot oppositorum predicator de aliquo eius oppositum removetur ab eodem, which means roughly, if one of two opposite predicates or concepts is predicated of a certain subject, then the other predicate or subject has to be denied from the same. So the idea behind this is two concepts are contrary to each other if and only if there cannot exist an entity X, an individual X, such that X has both the property A and the property B, while there may well exist some objects Y, such that Y has neither properties. So if A and B are contrary concepts like man and stone, then in generally you can conclude if it has one property, say being a man, it does not have the other property of being a stone. However, Abelard rejected this conditional: if Socrates is a man, Socrates is not a stone, because this implication in his opinion is not relevantly valid. The negative property of being not a stone, of not being a stone, is not contained in the positive property of being a man. but well, however convincing this consideration is, I want to leave open. It's clear that Abelard's main motivation for rejecting this particular conditional, so if Socrates is a man, he is not a stone, was his wish to refute the inconveniency of obtaining a counterexample to the connexive principles. Well, unfortunately, a certain Alberic of Paris showed that even without the assumption of the locus ab oppositis, one can construct other counterexamples to Aristotle's and Abelard's connexive thesis. And this is shown especially by the second embarrassing argument, which is as follows. See, so if Socrates is a man and not an animal, Socrates is not an animal. Now here we have the simple structure of conjunctive simplification. Next step, if Socrates is not an animal, Socrates is not a man. Why? Again, this is not a purely logical principle, but it is obtained by contraposition applied to the conditional P implies Q. In this case, if Socrates is a man, then he is an animal. This is a natural or relevant implication for Abelard, and Abelard also accepts contraposition, so he has to accept this crucial second step. But then the rest follows, like in the other argument. You obtain hence that non-P implies non-P and non-Q by contraposition applied to another instance of conjunctive simplification. And then in the next step, you get the final result that one proposition, namely the proposition P and non-Q, implies its own negation. You obtain this simple by transitivity. So this was Alberic's argument, and Chris Martin comments by saying, we do not know how Abelard responded to this argument, but it clearly illustrates the difficulties of constructing a connexive logic. Now, there have been many attempts have been made to escape this problem, to escape this to refute this ingenious Alberic arguments, which has been also referred to as Alberic's trap. Otherwise, it's reported that Abelard himself eventually granted the conclusiveness of Alberic's arguments. But other logicians in the 12th and 13th century made diverse attempts to escape Alberic's trap. Three main attempts shall be briefly discussed in what follows. As I've argued at some greater length elsewhere, none of these attempts succeeded in defending hardcore connexivism. So once again, returning to this distinction, humble connexivism is fully compatible with ordinary classical logic. In contrast, hardcore connexivism leads to a contra-classical logic. Thus, Heinrich Wansing explains, systems of connexive logic are contra-classical in the sense that they are neither subsystems nor extensions of classical logic. Connexive logics comprise certain non-theorems of classical logic as thesis, since classical propositional logic is post-complete. Any additional action gives rise to the trivial system, so that any non-trivial system of connexive logic will have to leave out some theorems of classical logic. A simplification of Alberic's argument shows that the usual laws of conjunction have to be given up. Otherwise, the self-inconsistent conjunction P and non-P would entail both P and non-P in contradiction to the first Abelardian thesis. However, conjunction. This is not enough. Also, the usual laws of disjunction have to be given up. This was discovered already in the 13th century. Robert Kilbarby, which we have heard already something in the first talk of this workshop, in his Notulae Libri Priorum, which is a commentary on Aristotle's Analytica Priora. In this book, Kilbarby tries to defend Aristotle's thesis against objections that had been raised by other logicians. In particular, Kilbarby recognized that the usual laws of disjunction, which you see here, give rise to the following counterexample. This is the same which Sarah already mentioned. If you are sitting, then either you are sitting or you are not sitting. But also, if you are not sitting, then either you are sitting or you are not sitting. More generally, P implies P or not Q, together with not P implies P or not Q, constitutes a counterexample to Aristotle's first thesis. So, the first attempt to escape Albrecht's trap is to be found in the Introductiones Montanae Minores. This solution is based on the idea that the conjunction of an affirmative and a negative proposition entails only the former but not the latter. Here's a quote. They write, because a negation is not so powerful when joined with an affirmation as it is when it is alone. And something follows from a negation alone, which does not follow from it when it is conjoined with an affirmation. This is their argument, and they try to support it by giving an example. But this example failed to be conclusive. Let's have a look at this example. They write, from the negation, Socrates doesn't dispute when conjoined with the affirmation when Plato is reading. It does not follow Socrates doesn't discuss with anybody, although this follows when the proposition Socrates doesn't dispute is put forward per se. This is their argument in favor of this position. But this example of a conjunction, they're speaking of conjoined, conjunction of two propositions is not a real conjunction in our sense, as it would be represented by the conjunctive operator N, but it's rather a conditionalization formulated in terms of when Plato is reading. And hence it cannot be used as a refutation of Albrecht's argument.
Sorry, 10 minutes.
Yes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Oh, okay. Then I have to speed up a little bit because I also want to talk not only about Abelard but also about Lenzen today. The second solution was suggested by the followers of Robert of Melun, who defended the view that no consequent at all follows from an impossible antecedent. They have the slogan ex falso nihil sequitur, where it is doubtful whether they really mean from a false proposition nothing follows, or only from a logically false or from impossible proposition nothing follows. Anyway, they believe that the admission of conditionals with impossible antecedents would lead to outright inconsistencies. They say if one assumes the opposite, it can be proven that a proposition entails its own negation. The two propositions, the two contradictories follow from one and the same proposition, and that the proposition entails another proposition which cannot be true together with it. Each of these conclusions seems to be against the art. For just as nothing can both be true and not be true, so it cannot be the case that two contradictories follows from one and the same proposition. But of course, no proposition Q can be both true and false, and therefore therefore Q and not Q cannot be implied by one and the same true proposition. But this does not mean that Q and non-Q cannot simultaneously be implied by any proposition at all. It is not against the odds that, for instance, the self-contradictory conjunction Q and non-Q implies both Q and non-Q. So the third way out, attempted by the Poretani, the followers of Gilbert of Poitiers, amounts to a rejection of the laws of conjunctive simplification. In their opinion, whoever holds that if P implies Q, then also P and R implies Q, commits, as they say, the fallacy non causa ut causa, which means the conjunctive antecedent P and R is preposed as the cause of the consequent Q, but the true cause of Q is P alone, while P and R is a not cause. Now, as Christopher Martin remarked already, this reservation of the Poretani concerns exactly the point made by Abelard Nelson in his account for the intentional relationship holding between the antecedent and the consequent of a true conditional. Therefore, I want now to check this famous paper of 1930 in some more detail. In this paper, Nelson offered a threefold defense of hardcore connexivism. On the one hand, he suggests a particular interpretation of the relation of inconsistency between two propositions P and Q. And on the other hand, he propounds a fundamental critique of the laws of conjunction and the laws of disjunction. This critique goes hand in hand with the introduction of two kinds of conjunction, namely aggregational conjunction versus joint conjunction. And similarly, Nelson's critique of the usual laws of disjunction is based on a distinction between two kinds of disjunction, a merely extensional disjunction and an intentional one. First, his conception of conjunction, which is contained in this longer quotations, which I think it's worthwhile reading after all. Nelson writes concerning conjunction, I do not take P and Q to mean P is Q and Q is 2, but simply P and Q, which is a unit or whole, not simply an aggregate, and expresses the joint force of P and Q. I say that P and Q is not a simple aggregate composed of P and Q because, for example, in asserting that P and Q entails R, I am not asserting something simply about P and about Q, but about them taken together. That is their joint force. P and Q does not entail R unless P and Q function together in entailing R. It is this joint force that gives to conjunction a unity which a mere aggregate or collection does not have. And this unity of conjunction is, in a sense, relational. For instance, the propositions all men are mortal and Socrates is a man form a conjunction in relation to conclusion Socrates is mortal. For Socrates is mortal expresses their joint force, but they do not form such a conjunction in relation to Socrates is a man. However, if P and Q alone be asserted, then the mere aggregate of P and Q is asserted, that is, P is asserted and Q is asserted. In such a case, the unity of conjunction is lost and the mere assertion of each component remains. So in this passage, Nelson introduces a really interesting distinction between two possible interpretations of conjunction, which I call the joint view and the aggregate view. These two brands shall here be distinguished also by different symbols, while Nelson symbolizes the conjunction by mere juxtaposition. I'm using this normal conjunction symbol for this aggregational conjunction or truth-functional conjunction, while the joint conjunction will be symbolized by the ampersand. A closer investigation of the logic of this joint conjunction appears to be an important and rewarding task, but it lies beyond the scope of my contribution. Suffice it to point out that whatever...
There was a mistake, then there is time to continue, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, I only need about 5 minutes. I just want to point out that whatever the proper law of this joint conjunction eventually turn out to be, they do not affect the validities, of course, of the laws of aggregational, simple truth-functional conjunction, which, of course, consists of the two principles of conjunction elimination, simplification, plus the influence of conjunction introduction. So my idea, first of all, let's also have a look at this quotation. Lenzen argues that the true conjunction does not obey the standard laws. He says, in view of the fact that the conjunction must function as a unit, it cannot be asserted that the conjunction of P and Q entails Q, for Q may be totally irrelevant to and independent of P, in which case P and Q do not entail P, but it's only P that entails P. I can see no reason for saying that P and Q entail P when P alone does and Q is irrelevant and hence doesn't function as a premise in the entailing. But even if it's taken for granted that the sophisticated operator of joint conjunction fails to satisfy the standard laws of conjunction, it still remains a fact that the less sophisticated truth-functional operator does satisfy these laws. Thus also Lenzen came to admit, I do not deny that from P is true and Q is true, we can pass to P is true. All I deny is that such a passage is in virtue of an entailment relation holding between P is Q and Q is true on the one hand and Q is true on the other hand. However, in my understanding of entailment, P and Q does entail P and it also entails Q in the sense that the falsity of the consequent P or Q is incompatible with the truth of P and Q. This has been admitted at least cautiously or restricted in a restricted form by Lenzen, also in some of his later writings. Now, concerning his conception of disjunction, we know already that in order to save hardcore connexivism, it doesn't suffice to forego the standard laws of conjunction. Also, the standard laws of disjunction have to be given up, as we know from Kilbarby. Accordingly, Lenzen developed some arguments against the validity of these laws. In particular, introduced, besides the usual operator, extensional disjunction, another operator of what he calls intentional logical sums, sum which he defines, he symbolizes it by a bold V. B, in this strong sense of disjunction, or Q, may be read either P or Q, but it holds only when there is a necessary connection between P and Q. It must not be confused with a simple P or Q, which is merely factual. Thus, his intentional disjunction is, as I understand this, sort of a strict disjunction, which might roughly be defined as necessarily P or Q. And clearly, the standard laws of disjunction are not valid for strict disjunction because the mere truth of one of the disjunctions is insufficient for the truth of the strong necessary disjunction. Instead, one probably has corresponding laws like these. If one proposition, say, P is necessary, then also the strong or strict implication P or Q is true, and similarly with respect to the other proposition Q. Probably these laws should hold. Lenzen doesn't say us whether he would accept it. Moreover, Lenzen didn't develop his theory of strict disjunction in any detail, nor did he try to connect such a theory with his view concerning the joint conjunction, which is very unfortunate. Notwithstanding the recent attempt of Mares and Paoli to reconstruct Lenzen's logic, one has to state that his calculus remains only a torso. Thus also McCall noted, although Lenzen formalized the notion of connexive implication and offered a handful of axioms from which he deduced a handful of theorems, he made no attempt to incorporate his insights into a full-fledged logical system. So as regards the laws of material disjunction, Lenzen had to admit that, as he said, of course, if P has truth, then P or Q has truth. Or as he also might have said, from P is true, we can pass to P or Q is true. Yet Lenzen insists that such an inference does not satisfy his criteria for a relevant entailment. He says P entails P or Q cannot be asserted on logical grounds because from an analysis of P, we cannot derive the propositional function P or Q, where Q is a variable standing for just any other propositional function whatsoever. The remark that from the analysis of P we cannot derive P or Q, I think somehow misses the point. We don't have to analyze the propositions P or Q, or the disjunction P or Q, in order to find out whether one entails the other or not. All we need to do is to analyze the logical operator or, and in my opinion, the truth of this ordinary, extensive and inclusive disjunction follows from the truth of either disjunct in the sense that the falsity of this disjunction is incompatible with the truth of one of the disjuncts. Finally, this is important to have a closer look at Lenzen's conception of consistency. In discussion of the opposite views of C.R. Lewis, Lenzen explains, no property of a single proposition P is sufficient to determine whether it is consistent or inconsistent with just any other randomly selected proposition Q. The meanings of both propositions are required to determine the relation. Though it may be that a part of a proposition is inconsistent with another part, the proposition as a whole is not inconsistent with itself as a whole. For instance, in regard to the proposition all men are mortal and some men are not mortal, the two component propositions are inconsistent with each other, but the whole component is not inconsistent with itself. Hence, Lenzen defends the following principle, which renders his logic hardcore connexive, namely the assumption that each proposition, absolutely each proposition P, is compatible or consistent with itself. to which I want to reply. But first of all, I want to point out that a similar view had already been put forward by the Stoic logician Chrysippus. However, neither Chrysippus nor Nelson provided a convincing explanation why a self-contradictory proposition like all men are mortal and some men are not mortal is consistent with itself. Of course, the inconsistency of two propositions P and Q normally results from the fact that one proposition, say, Q, somehow contradicts the other proposition P. Such a contradiction obtains if P and Q are contradictories or negations, like all men are mortal and some men are immortal, or if these propositions are contraries, like all men are mortal and all men are immortal. However, most contemporary logicians that I have met during my life, at least, have no qualms to consider a logically false proposition like P and non-P as self-inconsistent. After all, P and non-P contradicts itself in the sense that if, for instance, the first conjunct P would be true, then the second non-P would not be true, and hence the entire conjunction would not be true either. Okay, let me briefly return and conclude now by returning to this medieval discussions. Besides the attempts of the Montani, the Milidunenses, and the Poretani to escape Albrecht's traps, Chris Martin mentioned another possibility. He writes, one way to handle the difficulties of connexive logic is simply to give up the connexive principles, or else say that they do not apply in the paradoxical cases. Somewhat more exactly, the connexive principles don't have to be given up, they just should be restricted in the way of humble connexivism. As I've argued in a recently published paper, this is my final conclusion, humble connexivity maintains that a possible or self-consistent antecedent never entails its own negation. A self-consistent antecedent never entails both of two contradictory propositions, and a self-consistent antecedent never entails each proposition. This absolutely plausible condition has been approved by practically each ancient and medieval logician. Hardcore connexivism may be interesting, but it transcends this condition by requiring that also a self-inconsistent proposition P does not entail each proposition Q, which maybe, of course, can assume that. Hardcore connexivism also maintains that, in particular, this self-inconsistent conjunction does not entail both conjuncts, and in particular, it doesn't entail its own tautological negation. So whatever the motives may be which guide contemporary logicians in constructing calculi which satisfy such hardcore conditions, there may be good reasons, I don't know. They should at least stop claiming that their contra-classical logics are real elaborations of ideas that can be traced back to Aristotle, Boetius, Abelard, Kilvarpi, and others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang.
Luis, please.
I need to share the microphone. Sorry.
Thank you. I have too many comments and questions, but I will moderate myself, I promise. You know this paper by Eli and I on an Nelsonian response to the most embarrassing argument of the 12th century. So by the logical reconstruction of Alberich's argument, you can see many ways to escape the problem. And you concentrated here only on the problems relating conjunction and simplification, but you can also give a contraposition up, or you can restrict transitivity or whatnot. There are many other options. So the first question is, what do you think about those other options, restricting transitivity or contraposition or some other principles? Yeah, I have. Second thing is that I have to choose between the comment on Abelard or Nelson. So I will go for Nelson. On some of your slides, you say, okay, Nelson is attacking simplification for his intentional conjunction. But look, if you do this with the truth values of the propositions, then you can say that the entailment is good or valid because of this relation in the truth values. And I think that's fine, but it is nothing. It cannot constitute the base of a criticism of Nelson, because Nelson is not concerned with truth values at all. And also the notion of incompatibility, I can see that you say, but the negation of this consequent is incompatible with this antecedent, but in a very particular sense, sure, because it is incompatible with one part of the antecedent. But since Nelson held that the antecedent is a joint thing, it's a unity, it doesn't seem fair to say that incompatibility with one of those parts that might not be there because it is a unity, it's enough to claim entailment. So I'm not sure about the rightness of the reconstruction of Nelson here. So those are the two things. But thank you, I enjoyed it very much.
Okay. Of course, you're completely right that the problems which were first discovered already by the medieval logicians can be avoided by following different strategies, giving up something like transitivity, which was, as a matter of fact, one attempt already taken by some other logicians, which I did not mention. But I cannot now explain what I would in generally reply to attempts to give up transitivity implication. I would have a comment on one particular argument which was put forward in favor of this idea, but this would lead us far away, and also different strategies giving up. Well, you can try to give up anything, any classical principle, in order to avoid inconsistencies. But as regards Nelson, of course, my critical comments on Nelson's ideas are a bit unfair, because I bring in my own idea, my own understanding of entailment or inconsistency, which is just a standard Lewisian conception, which Nelson himself tries to criticize. So in a way, that's right. The point is that if Nelson himself is beginning to construct a logic, which he doesn't carry out, and then he says, I have this particular interpretation of conjunction in mind, joint conjunction, and this will not satisfy the usual laws. That's correct, and I appreciate that this is an important thing to consider, this joint conjunction, to find out what its logical laws are. But then the problem would be, it seems to me, if Nelson is ready to admit that one might incorporate into his logic with the joint conjunction also the operator of aggregational tooth-functional conjunction, then he would be forced to admit that, of course, tooth-functional conjunction satisfies these classical laws, and this suffices to derive counterexamples to the connexive principles. Yeah. Although his conjunction, of course, avoids these counterexamples.
Yeah, Ellie and I are having this discussion for too many months.
For too many months now, and she says, of course, he includes the extensional connectives. It's pretty obvious. And I say, no, it's not. He wants to exclude them. But yeah, I know it's this disputable thing. And finally, you quoted McCall saying that there is no attempt by Nelson to incorporate his insights into a full-fledged logical system. I think that's not true. There is an attempt in Nelson's dissertation. I would say there is a full logical system there. But again, this is controversial, I know.
Okay.
But thank you. Very nice.
Erich, please.
Yes, as you know, I have two objections here. And actually, I have a third objection. So these objections do not pertain to the exegetical analysis, but they pertain to the terminology and to the understanding of what connexive logic is. So I think that it does not make sense to talk about hardcore connexivism. Putting aside that, at least in German, this qualification as hardcore has some unpleasant connotations, I think it doesn't really not make sense, because there is this definition of connexive logic in Storrs McCall's writings. So he is the person who introduced the very term connexive logic in his doctoral dissertation in 1963, and then it appears in his seminal 1966 paper in the Journal of Symbolic Logic. So, and then thereby the term connexive logic has been defined. And there are connexive logics that validate conjunctive simplification, and in which Abelard's first thesis is not valid. This point will bring me to the second objection. But talking about hardcore connexivism is, for me, as if one would call intuitionistic logicians hardcore intuitionists, just because they are substructural subsystems of intuitionistic logic, or sub-intuitionistic logic one obtains by giving up, say, the assumption of persistence in Kripke models. So I think it really does not make a lot. It doesn't make sense to talk about hardcore connexivism. And then, yes, when you introduced your understanding of what a connexive logic is, you included Abelard's thesis. I think this is also problematic because it's not among it's not covered by McCall's definition. And as I said, there are connexive logics that invalidate Abelard's first thesis. So if we decide to work with McCall's definition, with which I think is a very good idea, then yes, Abelard's validation of Abelard's first thesis is just not required. And then the third thing, on one slide you mentioned something about what most contemporary logicians believe. Yeah. Well, this would exclude paraconsistent. Also, what you had there would exclude paraconsistent logicians, and in particular those paraconsistent logicians who are dialetheists. So maybe there are not so many dialetheists. I know that there's at least one in this audience, in this room. There are quite a few paraconsistent logicians. So I think this claim could use a qualification.
Okay, I have no problems with relativizing this statistical claims about most. This is not the point. Heinrich, your insistence on using a certain terminology doesn't convince me really, because first of all, you point out this is the early work of McCall, where he first introduced this notion, but he used the very notion also in later writings. And when he is writing his history of connexive logic, he is using, he is trying to defend that the idea of connexive logic and connexive implication has a history of 2,300 years. And if you take this in this strong sense, and one must say there is no history of connexive logic which can start earlier than McCord's own investigations. Everything else is only humble connexivity, which is in your term no connexivity. So I'm asking the rest of the audience here, are you willing to accept this, which I still believe, important distinction between restricted or humble connexivity and full or hardcore? Well, the expression, it was never meant as an insulting, having connotations like that. Just some hardcore connexivists believe everything contradictory antecedents make no exception, while others are willing to accept there are some exceptions. This is the very point of understanding this long history of connexive logic.
Thank you. Sarah, please.
Yeah, I have some thoughts to kind of respond to this discussion, and it goes back to something I've been feeling increasingly over the course of this workshop, which is that I don't think Aristotle actually subscribes to Aristotle's thesis. And it goes back to a point that I made, that he's dealing with a fundamentally different type of logic than the way we express it in modern propositional logic. And in particular, the terms that he's using, if we're saying that, what is impossible is that B cannot be both great and not great. This term great is a simple term. And when we are looking at simple terms, then I think this principle that he states seems entirely plausible and entirely correct. But the problem is coming up when we're talking about complex propositions, conjunctions, disjunctions, or you might think that you could simulate it with complex terms, conjunctive terms, disjunctive terms, but these just aren't something that Aristotle had. You get them in later medieval discussions. And so, yeah, I think that in your terms of definitions that maybe, if Aristotle is a connexivist, he's going to be a humble one, because he's not talking about this as an unrestricted principle. He's talking about this in terms of simple categorical terms. And then the other thought that occurred to me listening to you is that maybe the problem isn't with the connexivity of the conditional. The problem is when you add in disjunction and conjunction. And if you take things in this intentional sense, then even adding that in doesn't add problems. So I think that I feel some sympathy to Heinrich that this the hardcore connexive or just connexivity as introduced by McCall doesn't actually have a very long history. So it wasn't really a question, but just comments that have come up from the entire workshop and listening to what you had to say and what you had to say. So, yeah.
Well, first of all, of course, I not only basically, but totally agree with you about the interpretation of Aristotle's passage, which leads to so-called Aristotle's thesis, and in how far he would have subscribed to this principle as a principle of propositional logic. And I also defended the view that Aristotle was on. Okay, that Aristotle was at best defending a position which I characterize as humble connexivism. And the same holds true of Boëthius, of course. If you have a look at Boëthius' writings, he also is developing a term logic, but behind this principle, which is usually referred as Boëthius' thesis, there is a somewhat hidden principle of proposition logic, which we now refer to as Boëthius' principle. But then I just I forgot the second point. Was it a critical critical point of what I have said, or this?
It was responding to.
Yeah. What do you? Well, you think humble connexivity makes no sense to talk about it because it doesn't lead to contract classical?
But of course, I have no problem at all with drawing a distinction between connexive logics and humbly connexive logics. I have a co-authored paper where we talk about weakly connexive logics. So I have no problem at all with that. I have no problem with drawing a distinction between groups and abelian groups, between intercellistic logic and sub-intercellistic logic, but I would not call group theory hardcore group theory and intercellistic logic hardcore intercellistic logic. And actually, there's a book project which has a working title 60 Years of Connexive Logic, just because we are focusing on the concept introduced by McCall.
We have a question on Zoom. I give a chance first. Please.
Is it me? Is it my turn? And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So that'll be a good test for later on how the quality is. Yeah, I think I feel a bit compelled to weigh in on this as well. When I talked about humble connexivity, I didn't give a name to the other kind because I thought, well, connexive logic, like Heinrich was saying, is the default here. But sometimes I felt as well that it's useful to have something to say to call these things if we talk about humble connexivity and then the other kind. But as Heinrich also had the feeling, I had the feeling that hardcore was a bit well, maybe not an insult, but not, but implying that it goes too far. So I've started to call it ambitious connexivity if I need to give it a label. But that'll be my personal way of talking about it, maybe. As to the point where does it start and so on, I have no problem with the view of connexivity that just says, well, these are the axioms and full stop, and that's an approach. Just the only comment here that might be worthwhile is that it took me a while to find out that McCall is actually taking the term connexive logic from Bochensky, because he never says so in his publications, only in the doctoral dissertation. So in a sense, it does go a bit further back, and then Bochensky, of course, was talking about Chrysippus and so on. So maybe it does go back to all the way, just as a thought here. Yeah, that I don't know if Wolfgang is still in the room, but I do want to say. Otherwise, I really liked the papers. The talk was based on. I've read those, and so I did like the historical explanations you give in the talk as well. The only thing I find a bit misleading is when you say that classical logic is connexive in the humble sense. Because really it isn't. It's classical logic with the strict implication, which is a bit more than what most people would think about if they think about classical logic. So at least it is non-classical in the sense that it introduces some modal devices or a special kind of implication. If you just look at propositional logic in the classical sense, well, then this is not humble connexivity, and that was kind of one of the points I tried to make in that paper.
Well, of course, and you are completely right that when I talk about classical logic, in this connection, I was talking about classical modal logic and about strict implication, which is almost automatically humbly connexive. Of course, it's clear that classical logic as a theory of the only truth functional operators containing material implication, then the idea of connexivity is an extra ingredient, which material implication, of course, does not satisfy. This is entirely clear. But once again, to this question which we have been discussing here now for more than 10 minutes, I also have to remind that Beckall, when he explains his idea of connexive logic, you must not only refer to this 1966 article, but he says, connexive logic is a logic based on the idea first put forward by Chrysippus, when he says, and then there's a quotation from which we had here already. So where the word connexive appears for the first time in the history of logic. This is Stoic logicians, and their idea of connexivity may be read as something like relevance. But it is interpreted by McCall as characterizing connexive logic in his sense. But this Chrysipian idea, which he then also believes to find both in Aristotle and in Boethius and in Abelard and in Kilbarby and in many later authors, what these authors had in mind was only humble connexivity, something which does not work with respect to these few exceptions, impossible antecedents and necessary consequence.
Okay. Luis.
This is a difficult topic, and I cannot foresee what Heinrich will say. But yeah, I'm not entirely happy with the humble and hardcore terminology either.
Only the terminology, or the logical point behind it? Is it only the terminology? Because I get the feeling that I choose the wrong word.
No,
in this case, I would say, I'm sorry, let's try to find a better terminology.
No, it's not because of hardcore or something has strange connotations for some people. It's not like that. It's because it doesn't track the right distinctions, I think, as in opposition to sub X or super X or contra X. I feel I can manage better that kind of terminology than ambitious or hardcore or anything like that. That's my qualm against that kind of terminology. On the other hand, I would also avoid that kind of terminology, because for me, those are, in a sense, connexive principles, as you said. There is a wide family of connexive principles, not just Aristotle's thesis and Boethius' thesis, but I would also include Abelard's principle, or these principles by you and Andy and many others. As you said in your it's just what you said. Connexivity is this very broad notion containing a lot of related principles. And I can understand Heinrich's insistence on this is connexive logic. Okay, I would say this is McCall's connexive logic, but there are other connexive logics, including other principles. But I will joining him in saying we better not calling them humble or hardcore or anything, just with the names of the guys or people. No, I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Heinrich.
Well, I completely agree that connexivity is a broad term, and that other principles different from Aristotle and Boethius are discussed and have been discussed in the literature. But I mean, Wolfgang, you yourself pointed out that it's not even clear whether Abelard Nelson had developed a formal system of connexive logic. And so if you talk about, and also the medieval authors, of course, and the ancient authors, they did not have a notion of a logical system or logic. So whereas when this modern history of connexive logic started, McCall had clearly a notion of a logical system. So this is one thing I wanted to say. And then you emphasized that a modal logical connexive implication is definable if we think of strict implication, right? In modal logic, we easily obtain a connexive implication if we look at strict implication. Well, wasn't it also one thing you emphasized? In the discussion, at least.
Whether I really understand you. Is this microphone really working?
There's green light, yes.
Okay, good. So you're bringing up a new question,
yes,
whether it's possible to define connexive implication within the framework of modal logic.
Yes, I want to bring up a comment, not a question. So you pointed this out in the discussion, that strict implication in modal logic is a connexive implication, right?
The strict implication within the framework of modal logic almost automatically will be humbly connexive.
Humbly connexive. Good. Yes. Okay. And then there's a similar recent discovery. I just wanted to recall it, that in intuitionistic logic, one can define ambitiously connexive implication. So there's another example of where within a system, which one would not necessarily at first glance consider as a connexive logic, one can define a connexive implication.
Thank you, Heinrich.
Well, in personal communication, I already mentioned that this is an interesting point. Does anybody want to explain me how a connexive implication can be defined within the framework of ordinary modal logic with not intuitionistic but standard negation? So just deriving from the suggestion that Chrysippus first made, you can define an implication the following way. First of all, P has to imply Q strictly. That is, it's not possible that P is Q, that P is true and Q is false. And you also have to add some two clauses. Namely, first, P must not be impossible, and second, Q must not be necessary. Just add these clauses in order to define the implication operator, and it will become fully hardcore, fully connexive. So you don't need to resort to intuitionistic logic to get a definition of a clearly working connexive operator. It's a different point that I did not touch upon today. And there are variants. Mauro Nasti de Vicensis had suggested a related definition to that one, which I just gave, which also works. And then in connection with Nelson, I also discovered that, of course, it will be possible to capture a basic idea of Nelson's approach by using the standard definition of Lewisian strict implication and adding some extra component, because I think the basic idea of his notion of inconsistency is that he requires two propositions can be inconsistent or incompatible only if they say something different. So it cannot be the case that one proposition contradicts itself. This is his main point in the entire discussion with Lewis. And if you just add this as an extra requirement besides strict implication, namely that P and Q must be different in some sense, then you obtain again a different definition of a connexive implication operator, which is in line with Nelson's ideas.
Okay, there is no more time for questions. Thank you very much, Wolfgang.